3 squadron pilots flew at least 2, and sometimes up to 6 sorties per day from their Gambit airfield, mostly bombing and strafing the advancing enemy tanks, troops, and every close Luftwaffe airfield. During all of this, Nicky Barr was appointed CO on the 28th of May, replacing a hospitalised Bobby Gibbes who'd broken his leg and ankle after he'd bailed out from his Kitty Hawk.
I got shot down the first time by a rear gunner from Ju-88, the German bombers. They were flying in what we call diamond formation, just a triangle, and I was shooting at the gentleman in the rear of the diamond. And some nasty gunner in one of the other 88s set my engine on fire, which wasn't very good. I had long thought of how I'd get out. So in this case, because some of the boys had tried to get out with their parachutes caught over the back of the canopy, and they were spread eagle and couldn't get free. And one of them survived at the last minute by getting his foot under the joystick and pulling it back, and he went in flat. He survived. And I was frightened that might happen to me, so I rolled on my back, thinking this is the way to get out. And I had wound the trim forward, so when I released the joystick, I was shot out like a bullet, because I hadn't allowed for the aerial. I got tangled up in the aerial. I hit the tailplane, and it hit me. I've still got a mark on my knee where I hit the tail fin, and I got wrapped up in this blasted aerial. And on the way down, I eventually got the aerial away from me, pulled my ripcord, and the parachute opened. And then I watched my aeroplane going down. It was burning fiercely on the way, and I saw it hit. And then I suddenly heard the roar of an aeroplane. And now one of our pilots, Dudley Park, had been shot out of his parachute in a previous dogfight shortly before this. And I thought, my God, they're coming after me. And I started climbing up on the shrouds, trying to make myself a difficult target. And then the noise built up to a crescendo, and suddenly there was a mighty woof. I had actually watched this. It took the noise probably a second or two to get to me, and that was a second or two of real terror. I've been taught how to fold parachutes when I was at Richmond. So I still think I could still fold a parachute, but no one ever told us how to jump, how to land. I knew you should land facing downwind. That's about all I knew, but no one said you should land with your knees together and legs relaxed, and no one had told me that. So I landed with legs apart, landed crosswind, and broke my ankle. And I was there writhing in agony. I didn't know whether it was enemy territory or not. And eventually, I, sort of there in great pain. And some weapons carrier came up with a lot of nondescript-looking people. And I thought they were Germans. And because, as I say, I didn't know where I was, whether it was north, east, or west. So I put my hands up and surrendered. And one of them said, "Get up, chum." And I said, "Oh, pommy bastards." And then and don't call me chum. Stood in my dignity, but they didn't know I was a squadron leader. However, they were good fellows. They accepted it. Took me into a first aid post. They put a temporary splint on my left ankle, which was badly broken, and fibula broken. And eventually I got to hospital, and that was the first time.
By June the 17th, Rommel's forces had knocked out 230 Allied tanks and caused the Allied forces to retreat, including the entire 239 wing, which was No. 3 and 450 RAAF squadrons, and RAF 112, 250 and 260 squadrons. The entire wing had to leapfrog through 5 landing grounds eastward to Almeria from their Gambit base, returning almost to the squadron's starting point 18 months earlier. The Australian 9th Division and their British comrades had successfully held Tobruk in 1941, but a hastily organised garrison of South African Army troops were now rapidly compelled to surrender when Rommel stormed Tobruk with his superior panzer divisions on the 21st of June, 1942. By this time, the Africa Corps had driven the Desert Air Force further east, to airfields that were out of flying range of Tobruk, so air cover for the last desperate days of the Tobruk battle became impossible. Once Tobruk had fallen, Rommel immediately pressed eastward. However, by the 26th of June 1942, the Allies had rallied and pressed Rommel back, enabling both 450 and 3 squadrons to advance to Sidi Hanaish, and allowing the army to shore up the defence line at El Alamein. On the same day, Commanding Officer Nicky Barr, parachuting from 4,000 feet from his burning Kitty Hawk, landed in enemy hands and became a prisoner of war. When he went down, he was flying his 84th sortie with 119 operational hours since he had joined the squadron as a junior flying officer 6 months earlier. During this time, he'd claimed a record 12 enemy aircraft destroyed, making him 3 squadrons' top ace. In September 1943, after 3 unsuccessful escape attempts, including one that got him all the way to the Swiss border wire, Nicky eventually escaped from a POW train and linked up with special forces and partisans in northern Italy. He was subsequently awarded a military cross for his assistance to Allied escapees behind the German lines and participation in partisan attacks. After Nicky Barr was shot down, squadron leader Bobby Gibbes, with his broken leg still encased in plaster, immediately resumed command of 3 Squadron.
The worst time I had was after being shot down, breaking my ankle. I was put in hospital out in Gaza as 6th AGH, and they gave me a walking iron, and I found I was immobile. Now, I had taken my staff car up with me. I had a driver who drove me up to Palestine, and so I went and I complained to the commanding officer, Colonel Money. He was the chief doctor there. I said, "I'd like a posting, sir," and he said, "Why aren't you happy here?" I said, "No, I want to go to the first AGH, British hospital in Jerusalem." Well, he was very offended. He said, "Well, I'll send an ambulance." I said, "There's no need, sir. I have my staff car here. My driver will take me up." Because the moment I got in the car, I went into Gaza. I sent a signal to the first AGH in Jerusalem, where I was supposed to be going, and said, "Please delete posting Squadron Leader Gibbes. Gibbes now proceeding Heliopolis for medical board." That's Heliopolis just outside Cairo. Of course, I had no intention. Got back to Cairo. I had a friend who was a boss of Anglo-Egyptian Motors. I don't know, I think he could have been partially English anyway, but he was a nice guy. And I got him to make a walking iron for me. I had an iron on the bottom of my plaster, and I had another fitting made that I could then sit on the floor of an airplane and work the rudder, the brakes, and the rudders wouldn't worry me, but my toes, I couldn't move my left foot because of the it's in plaster. But by moving my backside backwards and forwards, I was able to put on brakes. So I got one of my pilots, Gordon White, to give me a check out in Harvard to make sure I could handle the brakes as I thought I could, and that was successful. So I got a Kitty Hawk and flew it back to the desert. And when I got there, the squadron had been taken over by one of our pilots, a Flight Lieutenant Nicky Barr, who's made an acting squadron leader, and he was, a fantastic fighter pilot. And I went to wing and I saw a chap, Air Marshal Tommy Elmhurst, and I said, "Well, sir, I want to be in it, but I obviously can't fly. Can I have a job with wing somewhere?" And he said he'd fix that up for me. That day, Nicky had led the squadron out, because I obviously wasn't able to. And when I got back to the mess, Nicky was missing. He'd been shot down and captured. Clive Myers, who was an Australian wing commander at that stage, tried to he said, well, okay, you better take over the squadron again. And I said, not in your nelly, I can't take over the squadron. I'd like to be with the squadron in some capacity, but not as a commanding officer, because I can't fly. He said, all right, they call me Gibbes. All right, Gibbes, I'll put a pommy in. I said, oh, God, you can't do that. So it's an all-Australian squadron. He said, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'll take over. And it's the unhappiest time I've ever had, because sending people out to fly in dangerous operations, and not being able to be in it myself, I found that was completely devastating, and it's the unhappiest time I had in the whole time of the 3 Squadron. Ultimately, of course, I cheated, and when I got the plaster off, I was supposed to go to Cairo for a medical board, so I put it over our doctor, Tim Stone. I disappeared for 2 or 3 days and went into Alex and had a few grogs, and I came back and I said, I've been in, and he said, where's your clearance? I said, oh, they're posting us to you, Tim, because I hadn't been near. So I couldn't fly because I had a fairly stiff ankle, and a squadron doctor, Tim Stone, had not cleared me to fly. So I used to get one of the boys to park an aircraft near my tent, and he'd be on the trip flight, but he'd come and sit in the tent, and I'd sneak into the aeroplane and fly. So I was flying illegally for a while, but no one woke up to it. And that way I was happier again.
That was at McRae, and he had been plastered, and he came back after 3 weeks and said, I'm ready to fly. And I looked at his leg, I said, when? He said, tomorrow. So we had to build the pedals up so he could fly, and he flew like that.
The same night Gibbes had resumed command, the squadron retreated, yet again, from an advancing enemy to reach the safety of Amira, behind the El Alamein line, 2 days later. Rommel, now a field marshal, faced the Allies with his 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions under the air cover of Bf 109s. From 2 and 3 Gruppe, JG-27, and Italian MC-202s from 4 Stormo, while 3 Squadron assisted in supporting the 8th Army, including Australia's 9th Division, who had arrived from Syria. For the next few critical weeks, the defence of El Alamein was a touch-and-go situation, particularly for 3 Squadron. They flew continuous operations escorting Boston light bombers from the South African Air Force's No. 12 and 24 Squadrons, and Baltimore's from No. 223 and 55 RAAF Squadrons. After a successful escort to target, the Kitty Hawks would dive bomb and strafe the targets as well before escorting the bombers home. On the 22nd July 1942, 3 Squadron's 1,000th bomb was dropped by Sergeant Keith Kildee at the crescendo of the First Battle of Alamein, which effectively stopped Rommel's advance. The build-up of forces at Alamein continued, with Rommel lamenting his long and vulnerable supply chain, stretching all the way through Tobruk and across the Mediterranean. Despite General Claude Auchinleck's recent success in the First Battle of Alamein, his earlier Western Desert retreat had suffered some disorganisation, and his counterattack against Rommel had run out of momentum. Consequently, he fell from favour and was replaced as Commander-in-Chief Middle East Forces by Sir Harold Alexander. Around the same time, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery became the new 8th Army Commander, a turning point for the Middle East, due to Montgomery's outstanding and energetic leadership in the months that followed. 3 Squadron resumed the fight on the 20th of August, with Bobby Gibbes leading the squadron back into action, performing armed reconnaissance and bombing sorties within the El Alamein area. 10 days later, the enemy attacked the El Alamein line at dusk, outnumbering the Allied forces. The strong divisions of panzers were eager to capture supplies of petrol and other vital equipment and stores. Rommel's objective was to secure the Alam el Halfa ridge before advancing north to the sea and capturing El Alamein. However, Rommel became seriously ill and was hospitalized back in Germany, and the Allied defense was well prepared with the Desert Air Force holding air superiority. New aircraft had arrived, as well as the US 57th Fighter Group with their own Curtiss P-40s. Mitchell B-25 medium bombers had also arrived with the US Air Force, and this increased air power released 3 squadron from bombing. On the 8th of September, Sergeant Garth Neal earned his Distinguished Flying Medal for shooting down firstly a Stuka, then a Bf-109, probably destroying another and finally chasing a third 109 over the tents of a German camp at ground level before it crash-landed near the camp. On the 15th, the Desert Air Force lost 11 aircraft during some intensive aerial combats, 2 of them from 3 squadron. The German ace, Marseille, claimed 7 of these in the 11 minutes between 1751 and 1802 hours. One of the pilots who went down was Flying Officer Jackie Donald, who became a prisoner of war, parachuting onto the top of an Italian mess tent. And another was Sergeant Scribner, who was killed in action. The fighting continued for 5 weeks, and among the losses was Marseille himself. On the 30th of September, his cockpit filled with smoke due to mechanical failure, and the aircraft had lost power when he decided to bail out. His chest had struck the vertical stabilizer, which either killed him or knocked him unconscious. His parachute did not deploy.
It was the 22nd of October 1942, and the battles on the front line were really solid, but the big offensive hadn't started. So when I arrived at the squadron, I met one chap in particular that I knew, and Johnny Hook was there, which was great because he'd been a great mate right through, and he'd already got 20 or 30 hours up while we'd been doing our cruising on the Nile, or the Blue Nile. So I had an awful lot to learn, and I was chatting to him, and a fairly solidly built but only 5'4" airman came in with his jacket on and said, "Who are you?" I said, "Righetti, sir." "Oh, I'm Bob Gibbes. How do you do? Now, you'll be on the next flight." "Right, sir. Have you ever dropped a bomb?" "No, sir." "Okay, well, you're off it. But you'll be on tomorrow morning." And that was my introduction to 3 Squadron. Bobby Gibbes was probably the most successful leader of a squadron in the Western Desert on any side. He was a wonderful leader, not spectacular as an individual like Clive Caldwell, but very successful. He shot down 12 or 14 airplanes, but he was like a mother hen. He kept the squadron together. He looked after you. A wonderful stroke of luck to go to a squadron with somebody so experienced. So the next morning, I took off on my first op, and Bob Gibbes said, "Now, Alan, you just hang on to my tail wheel. You fly behind me." We flew what they called fluid sixes. The leader, Shabby, was our squadron call sign. Shabby Red Leader, which was Bob Gibbes, or the boss, who was always called. Nobody else was called sir, but he was always the boss, or sir. So he flew in the middle of the 6, and his number 2 right behind him, and then he had another aircraft on his left and one on his right, slightly higher, about 150, 200 yards out from him, and a little bit ahead, and they each had a number 2 behind them. So that meant that all the aircraft in that 6 could weave to look for enemy aircraft. So they weaved, and head went right around a full circle around as you're searching the skies, whilst he could navigate. So he kept straight and level virtually and did the navigating. And so for a new boy, the thing was to hang on to his tail wheel and he'd get you through. So the first flight we took was quite a hairy one, as they called it. We ran into 109s and we had quite a dog fight, and a lot of chaps had been there 20 or 30 hours and never seen an enemy aircraft and not fired their guns. But I got into a dog fight the very first time and followed the boss down in a big spiralling turn. We were 6 of us were escorting bombers, so we were a bit tied to that, but anyway, it was a very hectic flight for my very first operational flight, and I was flying an old Kitty 1 with an Allison engine in, and the boss was flying a Kitty 3, which was quite a bit faster, so I had to overboost a lot to try to keep with him. But after we got through the dogfight and chased this 109 down and all sorts, we turned for home, got the bombers home all safely, and I landed right behind the boss, taxied in, and he said, bloody good show, Righetti. So I'd made it. Then that night, 800 guns opened up on the line and the Battle of Alamein was underway.
At 9:40 p.m. on the 23rd of October 1942, Montgomery's offensive at Alamein commenced with more than 1,000 British guns releasing the greatest artillery barrage since World War I. However, despite all his material and command advantages, Montgomery's Alamein offensive failed to break through.
For the first time, that's October 24th on, we started to gain the offensive. So, but in the desert, of course, we had been going up and back. Under Wavell, all the troops had advanced right up to Benghazi, and we were holding Tobruk, and then Churchill took away half the troops to try to defend Greece, and Wavell couldn't hold on with that, so they were seesawing backwards and forwards in the desert all prior to this. But we had not really inflicted a defeat on the Germans until Alamein. So life became very exciting, and I found it an experience you would never really want to have missed. It was so exciting. Everybody was concentrating so hard on getting the job done. We were in a theatre of war where we weren't hurting anybody except each other, the two armies. We weren't destroying villages and the sorts of things that were happening in Europe. So it was a good war. We escorted bombers a great deal. We ground staffed, we dive bombed, went on armed reconnaissance flights. We did a multitude of different jobs. The biggest disadvantage we had was a Kitty Hawk as a fighter bomber. And a fighter bomber is equipped to do all these different sorts of jobs, and it's quite a heavy aeroplane, big heavy aeroplane. Now our opposition, the Messerschmitt 109, particularly, is just a specialised fighter.
3 squadrons Kitty Hawks continued to provide bomber escort and ground strike missions over the following week. On the 28th of October 1942, Bobby Gibbes, flying the squadron's only Kitty Hawk Mark III, shot down a 109, bringing the squadron's tally to 200 aircraft destroyed, or so they thought. It would be later found that it was only the 175th claim.
Thanks for watching part 3 of 3 Squadron in World War II. Be sure to tune into the next episode as we continue the story of 3 Squadron in the North African campaign.